The woman's hands trembled as she counted the last of her coins on the polished wooden counter, knowing even before she finished that she was $10 short for the supplies she desperately needed. Adelaide Rose had been standing in Morrison's general store in Telluride, Colorado, for what felt like an eternity. The spring afternoon of 1883 stretching into something nightmarish as every eye in the establishment turned toward her failure. Her husband had been dead for 3 months, buried under an avalanche that swept through their small claim up in the San Juan Mountains, and the merchants in town had made it abundantly clear that a woman alone was not worth the risk of extending credit. "I am sorry, Mrs. Rose, but as I have explained before, without a man to vouch for your account, I cannot extend you credit," Herman Morrison said, his voice carrying through the store loud enough that the other customers could hear every word. His mustache twitched with barely concealed satisfaction, and Adelaide felt the familiar burn of humiliation creeping up her neck. She had flour enough for maybe 1 more week, no bacon, no coffee, and the chickens had stopped laying in the cold. Her daughter Emma was only 8 years old, and Adelaide would be damned if she let the child go hungry because some shopkeeper decided her worth had died with her husband. "Mr. Morrison, I have been a customer here for 4 years. My husband and I never missed a payment, not once. I am asking for $30 of credit, which I can repay once I sell the claim," Adelaide said, hating how her voice wavered despite her best efforts to sound strong. She wore her best dress, though it was faded and had been mended more times than she could count, and she had pinned her auburn hair up carefully that morning, knowing she would need every advantage. But it was not enough. It was never enough when you were a woman alone in a mining town where men made all the rules. The credit was extended to your husband, Mrs. Rose, not to you. "I have a business to run, and I cannot afford to give handouts to every widow who comes through that door," Morrison said, crossing his arms over his considerable belly. Behind Adelaide, she heard someone snicker, and she wanted nothing more than to disappear into the floorboards. She had been strong for so long, managing the claim alone after Thomas died, trying to keep everything together for Emma. But this public rejection felt like the final straw that might break her entirely. The door to the store opened with a blast of cool mountain air, and Adelaide barely glanced over her shoulder, too focused on gathering what remained of her dignity. She began sweeping her coins back into her small purse, her movements jerky and graceless, when a deep voice rumbled from behind her. "How much does the lady need?" Adelaide turned to find a man standing just inside the doorway, and her first thought was that he looked like he had walked straight out of the mountains themselves. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they nearly filled the doorframe, and his chest strained against the worn buckskin shirt he wore. His hair was dark brown and fell past his shoulders in waves that suggested he cut it himself with a hunting knife when it got too long, and his face was all hard angles and sharp planes, weathered by sun and wind and probably 1,000 nights sleeping under the stars. His arms were thick with muscle, visible even through his sleeves, and his hands looked like they could snap a rifle in half or gentle a spooked horse with equal ease. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had never needed to prove anything to anyone, and his eyes, startlingly blue in his tanned face, were fixed on Morrison with an expression that made the shopkeeper shift nervously. "I beg your pardon," Morrison said, his voice losing some of its earlier superiority. "The lady, how much does she need to settle her account?" the man repeated, stepping further into the store. He moved with a predator's grace despite his size, and Adelaide noticed he wore a large knife on his belt, and carried a rifle as casually as most men carried walking sticks. Everything about him spoke of a life lived in the wilderness. From his buckskin pants to the fur-lined coat he had draped over one arm despite the relatively mild spring weather. "This is not your concern, sir." "This is a private business matter," Morrison said, but his voice had lost its earlier conviction. Adelaide noticed the other customers in the store had gone quiet, watching the exchange with the avid interest of people who sensed drama unfolding. "I am making it my concern," the man said simply. He walked past Adelaide, and she caught the scent of pine and wood smoke and something else, something wild and clean that had nothing to do with civilization. He stopped at the counter and pulled a leather pouch from his belt, the coins inside clinking heavily. "The lady needs supplies. Total up her bill and add another $20 worth of whatever she might need. Coffee, sugar, flour, bacon, beans. Use your judgment." Morrison's eyes widened at the sight of the money, and Adelaide saw his calculation shift instantly. "Sir, that is very generous, but I cannot allow you to pay for someone else's account. It sets a poor precedent. You are just refusing her credit because she is alone. I am standing beside her now. Does that solve your precedent problem, or do we need to discuss this further?" The man's voice remained calm, almost pleasant, but there was steel underneath that made Morrison pale slightly. Adelaide realized this was a man accustomed to being obeyed, probably because the alternative was facing the full force of whatever violence he was capable of delivering. "I suppose if you are willing to guarantee her account, then that changes matters," Morrison said quickly. "But the payment must be made now in full." "Did I stutter when I said I would pay for it?" the man asked, and now there was definitely an edge to his words. He counted out coins onto the counter with deliberate precision, each one clinking against the wood like a small victory. $40. That should cover her current needs and my additions. Package it up." Adelaide found her voice finally, though it came out smaller than she intended. "Sir, I cannot accept this. I do not even know you." He turned to look at her fully for the first time, and Adelaide felt her breath catch somewhere in her chest. His eyes were the blue of a high mountain lake, clear and deep and impossible to read. Up close, she could see the small scars that marked his face, the signs of a hard life lived on the edge of survival, but there was something gentle in the way he looked at her, something that made her feel seen for the first time in months. "My name is James Walker. I trap and hunt in the mountains around here, been doing it for near 15 years now. I come into town maybe 4 times a year for supplies and to trade my furs. I just sold a good haul to the trading post, and I have more money than I need for what I came to buy," he said. His voice was rough, like he did not use it often, but his words were clear and measured. "I heard what he said to you. No one should be treated like that, especially not a woman trying to provide for her family." "I have a daughter," Adelaide said, not sure why that felt important to mention, but wanting him to understand what his kindness meant. "Emma. She is 8. And I will pay you back, Mr. Walker, every cent. I promise you that." Something softened in his expression, just a fraction, but enough that Adelaide noticed. "I believe you will, Mrs. Rose, but there is no rush on my account. You take care of your daughter first." Morrison had been gathering supplies with a speed that suggested he wanted this entire encounter to end as quickly as possible. He piled flour, sugar, coffee, bacon, beans, cornmeal, dried apples, and a small jar of honey onto the counter, along with the items Adelaide had originally selected. "This comes to $38.50. I will throw in the extra for goodwill." "How generous of you," James said flatly, making it clear he thought nothing of the sort. He helped Adelaide gather the packages, his large hands making the heavy flour sack look like it weighed nothing. "Where is your wagon, madam?" "I do not have one." "I walked into town this morning. It is only 3 miles up the valley," Adelaide said, feeling the humiliation return. She had sold their wagon and both horses to pay for Thomas's burial and to keep them fed through the worst of the winter. James frowned, looking at the pile of supplies. "That is too much for you to carry. I have my horse outside. I will take you home." "Mr. Walker, you have already done too much. I cannot impose on you further," Adelaide protested, but even as she said it, she knew she had no real alternative. There was no way she could carry 40 pounds of supplies 3 miles up a mountain road. "It is not an imposition, Mrs. Rose. It is common sense. Besides, I was heading up that direction anyway to check some trap lines," James said. It was probably a lie, but a kind one, and Adelaide found herself grateful for it. He gathered most of the supplies easily, leaving her with just a small sack of dried apples to carry, and headed for the door. Adelaide followed, acutely aware of the stares from the other customers and Morrison's sour expression. Outside, the afternoon sun was bright and warm, though the peaks surrounding Telluride still wore their caps of snow. The town had grown considerably since Adelaide and Thomas first arrived in 1879, with new buildings going up every month as more prospectors and miners flooded into the San Juan Mountains chasing silver and gold. The streets were muddy from the spring melt, and Adelaide picked her way carefully across the boardwalk to where James had tied his horse. The animal was as impressive as its owner, a massive buckskin gelding with a black mane and intelligent eyes. The horse was loaded with fur bundles and various packs, but James rearranged things with practiced efficiency, creating a space for Adelaide's supplies. He worked in silence, his movements economical and sure, and Adelaide found herself studying him when she thought he was not looking. He was younger than she had first thought, probably in his late 20s, though the mountain life had aged him in ways that made him seem older. There was something magnetic about him, something that had nothing to do with his obvious physical strength and everything to do with the quiet competence he radiated. "Can you ride?" James asked once he had secured everything. "Yes, though it has been a while," Adelaide admitted. She had grown up on a farm in Missouri, and riding had been as natural as walking before she married Thomas and moved west. James nodded and swung up into the saddle with fluid ease, then extended his hand down to her. "Give me your hand, Mrs. Rose. I will pull you up." Adelaide hesitated for just a moment, aware that accepting meant sitting very close to this stranger for the next hour, but practicality won over propriety. She placed her hand in his, and his fingers closed around hers with a grip that was firm but careful, as if he was very aware of his own strength. He pulled, and she gasped as she was lifted as easily as if she weighed nothing at all. She settled behind him on the horse, her skirts awkward and bunched around her legs, and had to wrap her arms around his waist to keep her balance. He was solid as a tree trunk, all muscle and no softness anywhere. Adelaide felt heat creep into her cheeks at the intimate contact, but James seemed unbothered, clucking to his horse and setting them into an easy walk down the main street of Telluride. "Which way?" he asked over his shoulder. "North, following the river valley. There is a fork about 2 miles up where a creek comes in from the east. We are another mile up that creek," Adelaide directed. She tried to maintain some space between them, but every step the horse took pressed her against his back, and eventually she gave up and just held on. They rode in silence for a while, leaving the noise and bustle of town behind as they climbed into the mountains. The valley was beautiful in the spring, with wildflowers beginning to bloom and the aspens showing the first hints of green on their branches. The river ran high and fast with snowmelt, its roar a constant companion as they followed the rough road upward. Adelaide had always loved this country, despite its harshness, but the last 3 months had made her question whether she could survive here alone. "How did your husband die?" James asked eventually, his voice quiet enough that she might have missed it over the sound of the river if she had not been so close. "Avalanche. He was working a claim up in the high country, trying to get one last load of ore out before the spring thaw." "The whole mountainside came down," Adelaide said, the words still painful even after 3 months. "They found his body 2 weeks later when the snow melted enough. He was buried under 20 feet of ice and rock." "I am sorry," James said, and something in his tone told her he understood loss, that these were not just empty words of sympathy. "We had only been married 9 years. Emma barely remembers what he looked like now," Adelaide said, surprised at her own honesty. There was something about James's presence that invited confidence, perhaps because he seemed so self-contained, like he would keep her secrets as carefully as he kept his own. "But you remember," James said. "Yes, I remember," Adelaide agreed. She remembered Thomas's laugh, the way he used to swing Emma up onto his shoulders, the dreams they had shared of striking it rich and buying a real house in town, maybe even sending Emma to school back east. All of those dreams had died with him under that avalanche, leaving Adelaide with a failing claim, a hungry child, and a town full of men who thought a woman alone was not worth their time. They reached the fork in the road, and Adelaide directed James up the smaller track that followed the creek eastward. The way was rougher here, barely more than a trail, and the horse picked its way carefully over rocks and through mud. The sound of the creek was louder than the river had been, a cheerful babble that Adelaide had once found peaceful but now just reminded her of how isolated she was up here. "How much longer?" James asked. "Just around this next bend. You will see the cabin," Adelaide said. As they rounded the curve, her home came into view, and she felt the usual mixture of pride and despair that it inspired. The cabin was small but well built, with a stone chimney and real glass windows that Thomas had hauled up from town. Behind it was a smaller shed that housed their few tools and the chickens, and further up the hillside was the entrance to the claim, though Adelaide had not been up there in weeks. James guided the horse right up to the door and dismounted with easy grace before reaching up to help Adelaide down. His hand circled her waist, and he lifted her to the ground as effortlessly as he had pulled her up earlier. Adelaide felt distinctly small next to him, though she was not a tiny woman herself, standing a respectable 5 feet and 6 inches. "Mama." The cabin door flew open and Emma burst out, her blonde braids flying behind her. She stopped short when she saw James, her eyes going wide at the sight of the massive stranger next to her mother. "Emma, it is all right. This is Mr. Walker. He was kind enough to help me bring supplies from town," Adelaide said quickly, moving to put herself between her daughter and James. She trusted him on some instinctive level, but she was still a mother protecting her child. James took a deliberate step back, making himself less threatening. He even smiled, and the transformation was remarkable, softening his hard features into something almost boyish. "Hello, Miss Emma. Your mama tells me you are 8 years old." "Yes, sir," Emma said, some of her shyness fading at his gentle tone. "Are you a mountain man?" "Papa told me stories about mountain men who live in the wilderness and can talk to bears." James laughed, a rusty sound like he did not do it often enough. "I do live in the mountains, but I cannot say I have had much success talking to bears. They mostly just want to steal my food." That made Emma giggle, and Adelaide felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. James began unloading the supplies, carrying them to the cabin door with that same easy strength he had displayed in the store. Adelaide hurried to help, and together they transferred everything inside. The cabin was neat but sparse, with just 2 beds in one corner, a table with 2 chairs, and a cook stove that took up most of one wall. Adelaide's few possessions were carefully maintained, and she saw James taking it all in with those sharp blue eyes. "You keep a good home, Mrs. Rose," he said when everything was inside. "Thank you, Mr. Walker, and thank you again for what you did in town. I truly do not know what I would have done without your intervention," Adelaide said, feeling inadequate to express the depth of her gratitude. James shrugged, looking uncomfortable with her thanks. "Like I said, no one should be treated that way. Morrison is a fool and greedy besides. He would have extended you credit if he thought he could profit from it, regardless of whether you have a husband or not." "Perhaps, but the fact remains that he did not, and you stepped in when you did not have to," Adelaide said firmly. "I meant what I said about paying you back. I am going to sell the claim. Thomas never found much silver, but there is some value in it, enough that I should be able to clear my debts and have enough left to get Emma and me back to Missouri where my family is." Something flickered across James's face, too quick for Adelaide to identify. "You are planning to leave Telluride. I have no choice. I cannot work the claim myself, and no one in town will hire me for anything more than laundry or cleaning, which does not pay enough to survive on. Emma and I cannot make it through another winter up here alone," Adelaide said, and hearing herself say it out loud made it real in a way it had not been before. She was going to leave Colorado, leave the dreams she and Thomas had built, and return home in defeat. "What if you did not have to leave?" James asked slowly, like he was working through an idea as he spoke. Adelaide frowned. "I do not understand. I have more money than I need. I could stake you through the summer, give you time to work the claim properly or find another option. You would not have to sell at a loss or rush back to Missouri before you are ready," James said. He was looking at Emma now rather than Adelaide, watching the girl explore the supplies with obvious delight at the jar of honey. "Mr. Walker, I could not possibly accept more charity from you." "What you have already done is more than generous," Adelaide said, though part of her desperately wanted to accept his offer, wanted the lifeline he was extending. "It would not be charity. It would be an investment," James said. "I have been living in the mountains for 15 years, Mrs. Rose. I know this country better than most men know their own parlors. If there is silver in your claim, I can help you find it. And if there is not, I can help you figure out what else to do. In exchange, you could cook for me a few times when I am in the area, maybe mend some clothes. I am a terrible cook, and my sewing is even worse." It was a transparent excuse, and they both knew it. What he was offering had nothing to do with meals or mending, and everything to do with him trying to help without making her feel like a charity case. Adelaide should have refused, should have maintained her pride and her independence, but she was so tired of fighting alone, so tired of watching Emma go to bed hungry while she tried to figure out how to survive one more day. "Why would you do this for strangers?" Adelaide asked, searching his face for hidden motives. She had learned the hard way that kindness often came with strings attached, especially from men toward women in her position. James met her gaze steadily. "Because I know what it is like to be alone, and because I can." It was not much of an answer, but something in his eyes told Adelaide it was all she was going to get. She found herself nodding before she had fully decided. "All right, but only if we draw up proper terms. I will not be in your debt without knowing exactly what I owe." "Fair enough," James agreed. He glanced outside where the sun was beginning to sink toward the western peaks. "I should head back to my camp before it gets dark, but I will return in a few days and we can discuss terms then. In the meantime, you have supplies enough for a good while. Will you not stay for supper at least? It is the least I can do after everything, Adelaide offered, surprising herself. She had not cooked for anyone but Emma since Thomas died, and she found herself wanting James to stay, wanting to know more about this mysterious man who had walked into her life and changed everything in the space of an hour. James hesitated, clearly torn, and Adelaide pressed her advantage. Just a simple meal, Mr. Walker. You said yourself you are a terrible cook. Let me give you one decent supper before you head back to your camp. Well, when you put it that way, madam, I would be a fool to refuse, James said, and that almost smile flickered across his face again. Adelaide felt something warm unfurl in her chest, something she had not felt since before Thomas died, maybe not even then. It was interest, attraction, the simple female pleasure in a handsome man's attention, and it made her feel guilty and alive in equal measure. She busied herself with the cook stove, using some of the bacon and beans James had bought to make a simple but hearty meal. Emma attached herself to James, asking him 1,000 questions about living in the mountains, and to Adelaide's surprise, he answered each one with patience and detail. He told stories about tracking elk through deep snow, about finding hot springs where he could bathe even in the dead of winter, about the time a wolverine stole his entire cache of dried meat, and he had to track it for 3 days to get it back. Emma listened with rapt attention, and Adelaide found herself listening too, fascinated by the glimpse into a life so different from her own. They ate at the small table, with Emma perched on a stool since they only had 2 chairs. The food was simple, but James ate like it was a feast, and Adelaide felt a flush of pride at his obvious enjoyment. After supper, Emma yawned widely despite her best efforts to stay awake, and Adelaide took her to bed, tucking the quilt around her and brushing a kiss across her forehead. "I like Mr. Walker, Mama," Emma whispered. "Is he going to be our friend?" "I think he might be, sweetheart," Adelaide whispered back. "Now sleep. Tomorrow we will have fresh bread with that honey he bought." When she returned to the main room, James was standing by the door, clearly preparing to leave. The cabin felt smaller with him in it, his presence taking up more space than just his considerable physical form. Adelaide walked him outside, where his horse was waiting patiently. "Thank you for supper, Mrs. Rose. It was the best meal I have had in longer than I care to admit," James said, checking his saddle cinch with automatic efficiency. "Thank you for everything, Mr. Walker. I still cannot quite believe what happened today," Adelaide said. The evening air was cool and she wrapped her arms around herself, wishing she had thought to grab a shawl. James untied his horse but did not mount immediately. Instead, he turned to face her, and in the fading light his eyes looked darker, more intense. "Mrs. Rose, I want you to know that my offer comes with no expectations beyond what I stated. I am not trying to take advantage of your situation. If you decide you would rather I not return, I will respect that. You just send word to the trading post in town, and I will stay away." Adelaide felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. He was giving her an out, making it clear she had power in this situation despite everything. "I do not want you to stay away, Mr. Walker. I think Emma and I could use a friend if you are willing to be that." "I am willing," James said quietly. Then he swung up into his saddle with that fluid grace that seemed almost impossible for a man his size. "I will be back in 3 days. That should give me enough time to check my trap lines and bring in the last of this season's furs." "We will be here," Adelaide said, "because where else would they go?" She watched as he rode away, his silhouette dark against the twilight sky, and she stood there long after he had disappeared around the bend in the trail. The evening was full of the sounds of the mountains settling in for the night, and for the first time in 3 months, Adelaide did not feel quite so alone. The next 3 days passed in a blur of activity. Adelaide used the supplies James had bought to cook properly for the first time in weeks, and she watched Emma's cheeks begin to lose some of their hollow thinness. She also took stock of what needed to be done around the cabin and the claim, making lists and plans like she had not allowed herself to do since Thomas died. There was a crack in the shed roof that needed patching, the chicken coop needed new wire, and the entrance to the mine shaft probably needed shoring up after the winter. It was overwhelming when she looked at it all together, but Adelaide had learned to take things one day at a time. On the morning of the third day, she found herself watching the trail more often than she should, listening for the sound of hoofbeats. Emma noticed and teased her about it, which made Adelaide blush and protest that she was doing no such thing, but they both knew it was a lie. When James finally appeared in the early afternoon, Adelaide had to resist the urge to run out and meet him like Emma did. "Mr. Walker, you came back," Emma cried, dancing around his horse with all the energy of childhood. "I said I would, did I not?" James said, dismounting and ruffling Emma's hair with an easy affection that made Adelaide's heart squeeze. He looked tired, with several days' growth of beard shadowing his jaw and dirt on his clothes, but his eyes were bright when they found Adelaide. "Mrs. Rose. I hope I am not calling at a bad time." "Not at all. Please come in. I have coffee on the stove," Adelaide said, smoothing her apron nervously. She had dressed carefully that morning, choosing her second-best dress and taking extra time with her hair, telling herself it had nothing to do with expecting company. James followed her inside, ducking slightly to clear the door frame. He accepted the coffee she poured with thanks and settled gingerly into one of the chairs like he was afraid it might collapse under his weight. Adelaide sat across from him, hyper-aware of Emma listening from where she was supposedly playing with her rag doll in the corner. "I have been thinking about your offer," Adelaide said, deciding to address it directly. "And I have some thoughts on terms if you are still willing to discuss it." "I am listening," James said, cradling the coffee cup in his large hands. "You mentioned helping me assess the claim and figure out if there is any silver worth pursuing. In exchange, I would provide meals when you are in the area and do mending or other domestic work. But I think that is too unequal. You would be providing expertise and labor, while I would just be doing things I do anyway," Adelaide said. She had thought about this extensively over the last 3 days, and she needed their arrangement to feel balanced, to feel like she was contributing something real. "What do you propose?" James asked, his expression interested. "If we find silver, we split it. 60% to me and Emma, 40% to you since it is our claim. If we do not find silver but you help me sell the claim for a fair price, I give you 20% of whatever we get. And in the meantime, yes, I will feed you and mend your clothes and whatever else needs doing, because that is what friends do," Adelaide said firmly. James was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. "You would give me a share in your claim. Mrs. Rose, that is a significant offer." "It is only fair compensation for what you would be putting in. I cannot work the claim alone and I cannot afford to hire proper help. Without you, I would be selling at a loss just to survive. This way, we both have something to gain," Adelaide reasoned. "All right," James said, setting down his coffee cup and extending his hand across the table. "But 60-40 seems too generous to me. How about 70-30? It is your claim after all." Adelaide looked at his outstretched hand, at the calluses and scars that marked it, and made her decision. She placed her hand in his and they shook, his grip warm and careful. 70-30. but you have to promise me that you will be honest if you think the claim is worthless. I do not want false hope." "I promise," James said solemnly. "Now, why do we not go take a look at this claim of yours? I want to see what we are working with." They spent the rest of the afternoon up at the mine entrance, with James examining everything with a thoroughness that impressed Adelaide. He studied the rock samples Thomas had left behind, inspected the shaft itself, and even crawled back into the darkness with a lantern to see how far the excavation went. Adelaide waited outside with Emma, listening to the distant sounds of his movements echoing back up to them. When he finally emerged, his clothes were filthy and he had a streak of dirt across his forehead, but his expression was thoughtful. "Your husband was on to something. There is silver here, not a bonanza maybe, but a solid vein if someone knows how to follow it. The problem is the excavation." He was working alone and did not have time to shore things up properly. "It is dangerous going back there right now." "Can it be fixed?" Adelaide asked, hope and fear warring in her chest. "Yes, but it will take time and some money for lumber. We would need to bring in timber to brace the walls and ceiling, make it safe to work. I would estimate maybe $50 worth of materials, plus 2 weeks of hard labor," James said. He was looking at the mine entrance as he spoke, and Adelaide could almost see him calculating in his head. "I do not have $50, Adelaide admitted. "After buying food and necessities, I have maybe $10 left to my name." "I have it," James said simply. "We are partners now, remember. I will front the costs for materials, and we deduct it from the earnings before we split anything." It was more than fair, it was generous, but Adelaide found herself nodding. What choice did she have, really? Either trust this man who had shown her nothing but kindness, or give up and go back to Missouri with her tail between her legs. When would we start? "I need to go back to town tomorrow to order the lumber and arrange for it to be hauled up here. While I am doing that, why do you not make a list of anything else you might need for the next month? If we are going to be working up here regularly, we should stock up," James said. That night, James made camp near the creek rather than riding back to wherever his normal camp was. Adelaide invited him to sleep in the cabin, offering to take Emma into bed with her so he could have the other bed, but he refused with a gentle firmness that suggested he knew it would not be proper. Instead, he set up a simple bedroll under the stars, and when Adelaide brought him supper, she found him so comfortable in his outdoor arrangements that it was clear this was his natural habitat. "Does it not get lonely, living out here by yourself?" Adelaide asked, settling on a nearby rock to watch him eat. Emma was already in bed, exhausted from the day's excitement, which gave them a rare moment of adult conversation. James considered the question while he chewed. "Sometimes. But the mountains have their own company, if you know how to listen. And I have been alone for so long now that I am not sure I would know how to live any other way." "How did you end up out here?" Adelaide asked, then quickly added, "I am sorry, that is too personal. You do not have to answer." "No, it is all right," James said. He set down his plate and stared into the small fire he had built, his eyes distant. "I grew up in Kentucky, youngest of 6 boys. My father had a farm, but there was not enough land to divide between all of us. When I was 16, he sat me down and told me I needed to make my own way. So I headed west, figured I would find something out here. I tried mining for a while, did not much care for it. Tried working cattle, that was all right but not what I wanted. Then I met an old trapper named Gideon who taught me how to read the mountains, how to survive out here. He died about 7 years ago, and I have been on my own since then." "Do you ever think about going back to Kentucky, seeing your family?" Adelaide asked. James shook his head. "My parents are dead, far as I know. And my brothers, well, we were never close. This is my home now, Mrs. Rose. These mountains know me better than any person ever has." There was something profoundly lonely in that statement, and Adelaide felt an unexpected kinship with him. "I understand that feeling. Sometimes I think Thomas never really knew me, not all of me. He loved the parts of me that made his life easier, that fit into his plans, but there were things I could never talk to him about, dreams I had that he would not have understood." "What kind of dreams?" James asked, his full attention on her now. Adelaide hesitated, then decided she had already said too much to stop now. "I wanted to do something more than just keep house and raise children. I wanted to matter beyond being someone's wife." "Is that terrible?" "No," James said firmly. "That is human. We all want to matter, to leave some mark on the world that proves we were here." They talked late into the night, long past when Adelaide should have gone inside. She told him about growing up in Missouri, about the books she used to read when she should have been doing chores, about her complicated feelings toward Thomas's death. James told her about tracking a mountain lion for 3 days because it had been killing livestock from a remote ranch, about finding a hidden valley full of elk that no white man had probably ever seen before, about the strange peace that came from being the only human for miles in any direction. By the time Adelaide finally stood to go inside, she felt like she knew James Walker in a way that went deeper than their brief acquaintance should allow. "Good night, Mr. Walker," she said softly, reluctant to break the spell of the evening. "Good night, Mrs. Rose and Adelaide." He spoke her given name for the first time, and it sounded different in his rough voice, intimate and careful. "Yes, you matter. I hope you know that," James said, his eyes reflecting the firelight. Adelaide felt heat flood her cheeks and was grateful for the darkness that hid it. "Thank you, James." She lay awake for a long time that night, listening to Emma's soft breathing and thinking about the man sleeping by the creek. She barely knew him, but she felt drawn to him in ways that both thrilled and frightened her. It was too soon, far too soon after Thomas's death, and yet she could not deny the flutter in her stomach when James looked at her, the way her skin felt electric when he touched her hand, the simple pleasure she took in his company. True to his word, James left early the next morning for Telluride, promising to return within 2 days with the lumber and supplies. Adelaide watched him ride away and then threw herself into work, cleaning the cabin top to bottom and making repairs to things she had been ignoring. Emma helped as much as an 8-year-old could, chattering constantly about Mr. Walker and all the things he had told them about the mountains. "You think Mr. Walker could teach me to track animals, Mama?" Emma asked while they were mending the chicken wire. "Perhaps if you ask him nicely," Adelaide said, smiling at her daughter's enthusiasm. Emma had been so quiet after Thomas died, withdrawn and sad, but James's presence seemed to have awakened something in her. "I like him, Mama. He is nice." "And he makes you smile again," Emma said with the blunt honesty of childhood. Adelaide felt her cheeks warm. "Does he?" "Yes. You have not smiled like that since Papa died." "I think Mr. Walker is good for us," Emma said decisively. And then she went back to work like she had not just turned Adelaide's world upside down. Was it that obvious? Could everyone see how she felt, this confusing mix of attraction and guilt and hope that she barely understood herself? Adelaide forced herself to focus on the work at hand, but her mind kept drifting back to James, to the way his hands had looked in the firelight, to the rough timbre of his laugh, to the kindness in his eyes when he looked at Emma. James returned on the second day as promised, but not alone. He had hired a teamster to haul up the lumber, and behind the wagon rode 2 other men whom James introduced as associates from his trapping days. They were both rough-looking characters, but they treated Adelaide with respectful courtesy and set to work unloading the supplies with impressive efficiency. Over the next 2 weeks, the small clearing around Adelaide's cabin became a hive of activity. James and his associates worked on reinforcing the mine shaft, and the sound of sawing and hammering echoed through the valley from dawn to dusk. Adelaide cooked for all of them, massive meals that disappeared almost as fast as she could make them, and she found herself enjoying the bustle and noise after so many months of quiet isolation. James worked harder than anyone, his massive frame seemingly tireless as he hauled timber and dug and braced. Adelaide tried not to stare at the way his muscles moved under his shirt, at the sheen of sweat on his neck and face, at the casual display of strength that left her feeling distinctly weak in the knees. More than once she caught him watching her too, his eyes following her movements with an intensity that made her breath catch. The other men left after 10 days, their part of the work done, but James stayed. They began the actual work of mining, with James teaching Adelaide how to use the pickaxe and shovel, how to identify promising veins of ore, how to move through the shaft safely. It was hard, brutal work, and Adelaide's muscles screamed in protest every night, but there was something deeply satisfying about it too. She was building something, creating value with her own hands, and she felt more alive than she had in years. They fell into a rhythm, working the mine during the cooler morning hours, then doing other tasks in the afternoon while Emma played nearby. James repaired the shed roof, fixed the chicken coop, and even built a small addition to the cabin that would give Adelaide and Emma separate sleeping spaces. He never asked for anything in return beyond the meals. Adelaide cooked, and her company in the evenings, when they would sit by the fire and talk about everything and nothing. One evening, nearly a month after they had started working together, Emma had fallen asleep during supper, and James had carried her to bed without being asked, his large hands gentle as he tucked the quilt around her small form. When he came back outside, Adelaide was waiting with fresh coffee and a question that had been burning in her mind for weeks. "Why are you really doing this, James?" she asked. "And please do not tell me it is about the silver or the meals or any of those other reasons. I want the truth." James accepted the coffee and was quiet for so long that Adelaide thought he might not answer. Then he said, "When I saw you in that store being humiliated by Morrison while everyone just watched, I saw my mother. She was widowed when I was 12, and the way people treated her after my father died, like she was suddenly worthless, like everything she had built and done meant nothing without a man to validate it, it made me so angry. I could not help her then, I was too young, but I could help you. That is why I paid your account. And the rest," Adelaide pressed gently. James met her eyes, and the vulnerability in his expression made her heart ache. "The rest is because I have been alone for 15 years, Adelaide, and I did not realize how empty that was until I met you and Emma. Being here, working beside you, talking with you in the evenings, it has reminded me what it feels like to be connected to someone. I like who I am when I am with you. I like the man you see when you look at me." Adelaide set down her coffee with shaking hands. "James, I am not sure I am ready for this. Thomas has only been dead for months. People would talk. They would say terrible things. I know. And I am not asking you for anything you are not ready to give. I just wanted you to know the truth, because I am tired of pretending I am only here as a business partner," James said. He looked down at his hands, those strong, scarred hands that had been so gentle with her daughter. "If you want me to leave after the mine is secured and you are set up for success, I will go. But I hope you will let me stay, even if only as a friend." Adelaide found herself moving before she had consciously decided to, crossing the small distance between them and placing her hand over his. "I do not want you to leave. I do not know what I am ready for, but I know I want you here. Is that enough for now?" James turned his hand over so their palms met, his fingers curling around hers. "That is more than enough. We have time, Adelaide. We do not have to rush anything." That night marked a subtle shift in their relationship, an acknowledgement of feelings that had been building since the day they met. They did not act on those feelings, not yet, but they stopped pretending they did not exist. James would brush Adelaide's hair back when it fell in her face while she was cooking. Adelaide would press closer to him than strictly necessary when he was teaching her how to shore up a tunnel wall. Their eyes would meet across the cabin and hold whole conversations happening in silence. Emma, with a child's intuition, seemed to sense the change and decided she approved. She began calling James Uncle James without being prompted, and she would insert herself between them at every opportunity, holding both their hands or sitting across both their laps, like she was trying to physically bind them together. The silver vein proved to be better than James had initially estimated, and by the time summer arrived in full force, they had extracted enough ore to make Adelaide's financial situation significantly more stable. James took a load into town to the assay office and came back with more money than Adelaide had seen since arriving in Colorado. After deducting James's share and the costs of materials, Adelaide had over $300, a small fortune that meant she and Emma were secure for at least a year, maybe longer if she was careful. "We should celebrate," James announced, swinging down from his horse with a grin that made him look years younger. "I bought steaks in town, real beefsteaks and some supplies for a proper feast." That evening they cooked together, crowded around Adelaide's small stove while Emma danced around their feet in excitement. They ate outside as the sun set, painting the peaks around them in shades of gold and pink, and Adelaide felt a contentment settle over her that she had not known was possible. Emma fell asleep in James's lap after supper, and he carried her to bed again while Adelaide cleaned up. When he came back out, Adelaide was standing at the edge of the clearing, looking up at the emerging stars. James came to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body, and they stood in comfortable silence for several minutes. "I have been thinking," Adelaide said eventually, "about what you said about wanting to stay, about us. Have you?" James's voice was carefully neutral, but Adelaide could hear the hope underneath. "Emma loves you. You know that, do you not?" Adelaide said, glancing up at him. In the twilight, his profile was all sharp angles and shadows. "I love her too. She is a remarkable girl," James said honestly. "And I think I am falling in love with you, James Walker, which terrifies me because I am not sure I know how to do this, how to feel this way about someone who is not Thomas," Adelaide admitted, the words tumbling out faster than she intended. James turned to face her fully, his hands coming up to frame her face with a gentleness that contradicted his sighs. "Adelaide, you do not have to know how. We will figure it out together. And you do not have to feel guilty for moving forward with your life. Thomas would want you to be happy." "How can you be sure?" Adelaide whispered. "Because I would want the same thing for you if I were in his place. If something happened to me, I would want you to find someone who would love you and Emma the way you deserve." "I would want you to live, not just survive," James said, his thumbs brushing away tears Adelaide had not realized were falling. She reached up to cover his hands with her own, turning her face to press a kiss to his palm. "Then stay. Not as a business partner or a friend, but as whatever this is between us. Stay and let us see where this goes." James's answer was to lower his head and kiss her, soft and careful at first, like he was afraid she might break. But when Adelaide pressed closer, her hands fisting in his shirt, the kiss deepened into something that spoke of months of restrained want. His arms came around her, lifting her almost off her feet, and Adelaide felt safe and desired and alive in a way she had not felt in years, maybe ever. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, James rested his forehead against hers. "I have wanted to do that since the first day I saw you standing in Morrison's store, looking so fierce and proud despite how he was treating you. I have wanted you to," Adelaide confessed. "I just did not think I was allowed to want it." "You are allowed to want anything you want," Adelaide Rose. "You are allowed to be happy," James said firmly, and then he kissed her again, slower this time, like they had all the time in the world. They courted properly after that, as properly as two people living in close proximity in the wilderness could manage. James moved his camp closer to the cabin, but maintained a separate residence to preserve Adelaide's reputation as much as possible. He started teaching Emma to track and hunt, taking her on long walks through the forest while Adelaide worked on improving the cabin or processing ore. And in the evenings, when Emma was asleep, James and Adelaide would sit together, talking and planning and stealing kisses like teenagers. The summer passed in a golden haze of work and laughter and slowly deepening love. James helped Adelaide establish a real mining operation, hiring a few men from town to help extract the silver, while he handled the technical aspects of following the vein and keeping everything safe. The mine proved to be even more valuable than they had hoped, producing steadily throughout the summer months. In August, James took Adelaide and Emma to Telluride for the supply run, and they walked through town together, James carrying Emma on his shoulders while Adelaide held his arm. They stopped at Morrison's general store, and Adelaide felt a savage satisfaction at the way the merchant's expression soured when he saw them together. "Mr. Walker, Mrs. Rose," Morrison said stiffly, "what can I do for you today?" "We need a full load of winter supplies," James said pleasantly, but there was steel in his voice. "And we will be paying in cash, though I suspect Mrs. Rose's credit is good these days, now that her mine is producing." Morrison had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Yes, well, I am always happy to extend credit to valued customers. Strange how someone's value changes when they have a man standing beside them," Adelaide said sweetly. "Or when they have money in their pocket. I wonder which matters more to you, Mr. Morrison." They left the store with their supplies and Morrison's sour expression as a parting gift, and Adelaide felt like she had reclaimed some small piece of her dignity. James squeezed her hand and whispered, "I am proud of you," which made her feel warm all over. As autumn approached and the aspen leaves turned gold, James started talking about the future in more concrete terms. He wanted to know if Adelaide would consider staying in Colorado permanently, if she thought the claim could support them all year round, if Emma would be happy living in the mountains instead of going back to Missouri. Adelaide found herself answering yes to all of it, because somewhere over the summer, this place had stopped being Thomas's dream and had become hers. One evening in late September, with the first hints of cold in the air, James asked Emma to take a walk with him down to the creek. Adelaide watched them go, James's large hand engulfing Emma's small one, and she felt her heart swell with love for both of them. When they returned half an hour later, Emma was grinning from ear to ear and practically vibrating with excitement. "Mama, Uncle James asked me if it would be all right if he married you, and I said yes. Is that all right? Did I do good?" Emma burst out the moment they were in earshot. Adelaide looked from her daughter to James, who had the grace to look slightly sheepish. "You asked her first. I wanted to make sure she was comfortable with the idea before I asked you. Emma is part of this too, and her feelings matter," James said, moving closer. "But now I am asking you, Adelaide Rose. I know it has only been 6 months and people will talk, but I do not care about any of that. I love you. I love Emma. I want to build a life with both of you here in these mountains. Will you marry me?" He pulled a ring from his pocket, a simple gold band with a small sapphire set in it. "It is not much, but the stone matches your eyes." Adelaide realized she was crying, happy tears this time, and she nodded because words seemed insufficient. "Yes, yes, I will marry you." James slipped the ring onto her finger and kissed her while Emma cheered and danced around them. It was perfect, it was right, and Adelaide felt like she was finally where she was meant to be. They were married in Telluride a month later, in a simple ceremony at the small church with Emma as their only witness. Adelaide wore a new dress that James had insisted on buying, a deep blue that brought out her eyes, and James looked almost uncomfortable in a proper suit, though he wore it for her sake. The minister gave them a slightly disapproving look, clearly calculating how recently Adelaide had been widowed, but he performed the ceremony without comment. Afterward, they went to the hotel for a celebratory meal, just the three of them, and Adelaide felt like she was floating. Emma ate too much cake and made herself slightly sick, but she was so happy that neither adult had the heart to scold her. That night, Adelaide and James shared a bed for the first time as husband and wife in the hotel room while Emma slept in a cot nearby. And Adelaide discovered that passion and love and safety could all exist in the same moment. They returned to the cabin the next day as a family, and James moved his few belongings into the space he had built onto the cabin months ago. Life settled into a new rhythm, one that felt both exciting and comfortable. James continued to work the mine with Adelaide, and they made plans to expand operations in the spring. Emma thrived under their combined attention, growing stronger and more confident with each passing day. Winter came to the San Juan Mountains with its usual ferocity, but Adelaide faced it without fear this year. The cabin was well stocked with supplies. The mine had produced enough that they had money in the bank, and most importantly, she was not alone. James's presence filled the small space with warmth and security, and Adelaide found herself grateful for the long dark evenings that kept them all inside together, playing games with Emma or reading by lantern light while the wind howled outside. On Christmas morning, Adelaide woke to find James already up, stoking the fire and preparing coffee. Emma was still asleep, giving them a rare moment alone. Adelaide wrapped a blanket around herself and went to stand beside him, tucking herself under his arm. "Merry Christmas, wife," James said, kissing the top of her head. "Merry Christmas, husband," Adelaide replied, still getting used to the words. "Are you happy?" "Happier than I ever thought I could be," James said honestly. "A year ago I was alone in the mountains, convincing myself that I did not need anyone. And now I have you and Emma, a home, a purpose beyond just surviving." "You gave me that, Adelaide." "We gave it to each other," Adelaide corrected. "I was drowning when you found me, James. You saved me in that store, and you have been saving me every day since." They stood together in the quiet morning, watching the fire burn and listening to Emma begin to stir. Later, there would be a modest gift exchange and a special Christmas dinner. Later, there would be laughter and joy and the simple pleasures of family. But in that moment, Adelaide simply stood with her husband and marveled at how much her life had changed in less than a year. How a single act of kindness from a stranger had transformed into a love that filled all the empty places in her heart. Spring arrived with the usual rush of melt water and greening earth, and Adelaide discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with a complicated mixture of joy and fear, but James's wholehearted delight helped settle her nerves. Emma was ecstatic at the prospect of a sibling, already planning all the things she would teach the baby. "What if something goes wrong?" Adelaide asked James one night, her hands resting on her still flat stomach. I am not young, James. I am 32, and out here so far from doctors. Then we will go to town when you are closer to your time. We can rent a room at the hotel, stay there until the baby comes so you have medical help nearby, James said practically. And nothing is going to go wrong, Adelaide. You are strong and healthy, and I will take care of you. His confidence helped, and Adelaide found herself relaxing into the pregnancy, allowing herself to be excited rather than afraid. They hired more help for the mine so Adelaide could rest when she needed to, and James took over more of the heavy work around the cabin. Emma appointed herself Adelaide's guardian, constantly fussing over her mother and bringing her things she thought might be helpful. In June, they made the trip to Telluride and took rooms at the hotel. James hired a midwife and a doctor to be on standby, paying them extra to be available at a moment's notice. Adelaide spent the last weeks of her pregnancy in relative comfort, with James and Emma keeping her entertained and cared for. Their son was born on a hot afternoon in late July, arriving with a lusty cry that announced his presence to the world. He was big and healthy, with a thick head of dark hair and his father's blue eyes. James held him with the careful reverence of a man who had never expected to be a father, tears streaming down his face while Adelaide watched with her own eyes wet. "What should we name him?" James asked, his voice rough with emotion. Adelaide had been thinking about this for months. "Thomas, after my first husband. He would have wanted Emma to have a brother, and I think it honors his memory." James looked at her with such love that Adelaide felt her heart might burst. "Thomas Walker. It is a good, strong name. He will grow up knowing he is named after a brave man." They brought baby Thomas home to the cabin a week later, and life shifted once again to accommodate this new small person. Emma was a devoted big sister, always wanting to help with the baby, and James proved to be a patient and loving father. Adelaide watched her husband with their son and fell in love with him all over again, seeing the gentleness with which he handled the tiny body, the songs he would sing in his rough voice to soothe Thomas to sleep. The years that followed were full and busy. The mine continued to produce, allowing them to expand the cabin into a proper house with multiple bedrooms and even a parlor. James hired a manager to oversee day-to-day operations so he could spend more time with his growing family. Emma started school in Telluride, boarding in town during the week and coming home on weekends, growing from a girl into a poised young woman. Thomas grew into a sturdy boy who followed his father everywhere, learning to track and hunt and raid the mountains. Adelaide gave birth to a daughter 3 years after Thomas, a little girl they named Julia, who had her mother's auburn hair and gentle disposition. And 2 years after Julia came another son, John, who was adventurous and wild from the moment he could crawl. Their house became a center of warmth and life in the mountains, with friends and neighbors stopping by regularly. Even Morrison from the general store eventually became cordial, though Adelaide never quite forgave him for that day in his store. She and James would laugh about it sometimes, about how a moment of cruelty had led to so much happiness, about how standing beside someone when they needed it could change the course of 2 lives entirely. On their 10th wedding anniversary, James surprised Adelaide with a trip to Denver, just the 2 of them while Emma watched her younger siblings. They stayed in a fancy hotel and ate at restaurants and went to the theater, playing at being civilized city folk for a few days. But Adelaide found herself eager to return to their mountain home, to the life they had built together. "You ever regret it?" Adelaide asked James on their last night in Denver, as they sat on the balcony of their hotel room watching the city lights. "Giving up your solitary life in the wilderness to be tied down with a wife and children." James pulled her close, his arms solid and warm around her shoulders. Not for a single second. I thought I was happy before, but I did not know what happy really meant until I walked into Morrison's store and saw you standing there, refusing to be beaten down. You gave me a life worth living, Adelaide. You and the children are my whole world. Adelaide rested her head on his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of him. I was so broken when you found me. I thought my life was over, that I would never be anything more than Thomas's widow struggling to survive. But you saw something in me, James. You stood beside me when no one else would. And I will stand beside you for the rest of our lives, James promised. Whatever comes, we face it together. They returned home to chaos and laughter, to children who had missed them and a house that felt more welcoming than any grand hotel. Emma had managed the household competently in their absence, proving she was becoming a capable young woman. Thomas had apparently been a handful, getting into all sorts of mischief, but nothing serious. Julia and John were just happy to have their parents back. The years continued to pass in the way they do, full of small joys and occasional sorrows. The mine eventually played out, but by then, James and Adelaide had invested wisely and owned several properties in Telluride. Emma grew up and married a kind young man who worked at the bank, giving Adelaide and James their first grandchild. Thomas took over management of their remaining mining interests, showing a head for business that surprised everyone. Julia became a teacher, and John, wild to the end, became a guide for wealthy hunters and tourists who wanted to experience the mountains. Adelaide and James grew old together in their mountain home, their hair going gray and then white, their movements becoming slower but their love remaining constant. On summer evenings, they would sit on the porch they had added to the house, watching the sunset paint the peaks in shades of gold and remembering. You remember the day we met? Adelaide asked one evening when they were both in their 70s, their hands clasped together the way they had been for nearly 40 years. Every detail, James said. You were wearing a faded blue dress, and your hands were shaking as you counted your coins. Morrison was being cruel and everyone else just watched. And I thought to myself, that woman needs someone to stand beside her. I did not know then that standing beside you would become my life's greatest purpose. You saved me that day, Adelaide said softly. In every way a person can be saved. We saved each other, James corrected, just as he always did. I was just surviving before you, Adelaide. You taught me how to live. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the mountains they had called home for so long. Their children and grandchildren would visit tomorrow, filling the house with noise and life. But tonight, it was just the two of them, the mountain man and the widow who had found each other in a moment of crisis and built a love that had lasted a lifetime. When James died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 82, Adelaide mourned deeply, but without regret. They had been given decades together, had raised 4 children and seen them become successful adults, had built a life that mattered. She lived another 3 years, surrounded by her family, and when her own time came, she went quietly with a smile on her face. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking their valley, with a simple stone that read James Walker and Adelaide Rose Walker. They stood beside each other. Emma made sure the grave was always tended, and she told her own children and grandchildren the story of how their grandparents met, about the merchant who refused credit and the mountain man who paid the account and changed 2 lives forever. The house stood for generations, eventually becoming a historical landmark that tourists would visit, marveling at the thought of people carving out a life in such remote territory. But those who knew the real story understood it was never about the house or the mine or even the mountain setting. It was about 2 people finding each other when they each needed someone most, about choosing love and partnership over loneliness and pride. about standing beside someone not because you had to, but because you wanted to more than anything else in the world. In the end, Adelaide and James's story became the kind of legend that the mountains keep, passed down through generations of families who knew that real love was not about grand gestures or perfect timing. It was about showing up when someone needed you, about standing beside them through hardship and joy, about building something lasting from a single moment of kindness. The mountains remembered them long after they were gone, as they remember all true love stories, and the wind through the aspens still seemed to whisper their names on quiet summer evenings, a reminder that some bonds transcend even death itself. Their descendants continue to live in the Telluride area, each generation adding their own chapters to the family story, but never forgetting where it all began. The original mine claim, long since played out, remained in the family as a reminder of what Adelaide and James had built together. And every year, on the anniversary of that day in Morrison's store, the family would gather at the grave site on the hill, and someone would retell the story, keeping the memory alive for the children who never knew them but whose lives were shaped by their love nonetheless. The story of Adelaide Rose and James Walker became more than just family history. It became a testament to the power of compassion, to the importance of standing beside those who need support, to the beautiful unpredictability of love. In a harsh land that demanded strength and resilience, they had found tenderness. In a time that did not always value women's independence, James had seen Adelaide as an equal partner. And in a moment when Adelaide had felt most alone and defeated, James had proven that sometimes strangers become family, that sometimes a single act of kindness can change everything. Their love story was not one of dramatic rescues or grand romantic gestures, though it had its share of both. Instead, it was a story of two people choosing each other every day, of building a life brick by brick and moment by moment, of standing beside each other through everything that life in the wild mountains could throw at them. It was a story of respect and partnership, of passion that lasted decades, of a family built on love rather than just obligation. And perhaps most importantly, it was a story that reminded everyone who heard it that love could come from the most unexpected places, at the most unexpected times, and that the greatest adventures often began with a simple decision to stand beside someone who needed you. Morrison's cruelty had inadvertently created a love story that would outlast him by generations, proving that even in our worst moments, grace can enter if we are open to it. The mountains stood eternal above Telluride, silent witnesses to countless human dramas, but even they seemed to remember Adelaide and James differently. The valley where they built their home remained beautiful, the creek still babbling its endless song, the aspen still turning gold each autumn. And sometimes, visitors to the area would swear they felt something in that place, a sense of peace and rightness, as if the very earth remembered the love that had flourished there. Their great-great-grandchildren still lived in Colorado, carrying forward the values that Adelaide and James had instilled in their family. They told their children to stand up for those who needed support, to judge people by their character rather than their circumstances, to build relationships based on respect and equality. They taught that true strength included gentleness, that independence did not preclude partnership, that love was something you built rather than something that just happened to you. And every so often, someone would stand in Morrison's old general store, now converted to a museum of Telluride history, and they would see the place where it all began. They would imagine a woman counting coins with shaking hands, a merchant refusing credit, and a mountain man walking through the door at just the right moment. They would think about all the ripples that spread from that single moment, about the family that grew from one man's decision to stand beside a stranger, about the love that transformed two lonely people into partners who shaped each other's destiny. The story of Adelaide Rose and James Walker was more than history. It was proof that kindness mattered, that courage came in many forms, that love could heal wounds that seemed unhealable. It was a reminder that we are all connected, that our actions ripple outward in ways we can never fully predict, and that sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply stand beside someone and tell them they are not alone. In the end, that was what their love story had always been about. Not about rescue or salvation, though it had elements of both. Not about grand romance, though they had known passion that lasted decades. It was about two people who found each other in a moment of need and chose to walk through life together, to build something lasting from nothing, to create a family and a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. It was about standing beside someone, through good times and bad, through triumph and tragedy, through all the endless moments that make up a life. And it was about love, the kind of love that starts with kindness, grows through partnership, and lasts forever in the memories of those who come after. That was the true gift that Adelaide and James gave to their descendants, and to anyone who heard their story. The knowledge that love like theirs was possible, that it could happen to anyone, and that it all started with someone deciding to stand beside another person when they needed it most.